Let's start right here, under a sky so bright it made your eyes water. It was July 1885 in Bear Ridge, Wyoming territory, a place most folks pass through and never look back on. But for some, it was the only spot on God's earth where they ever belonged. The saloon was alive with the sounds that made up the heartbeat of the Wild West. Poker chips clacking, boots dragging across warped floorboards, and the low hush of cowboys bragging about things they'd never really done. Then came a hush, so sudden you could almost feel it pressing against your skin. A barefoot girl stepped out from behind the barrels by the door. Her cheeks were red from the heat. Her dress faded to a tired gray. She looked too young to be out alone, too thin to have survived many meals. But her voice carried clear across the room when she asked, "May I have your leftovers, sir?" Nobody spoke, not even the drunks in the corner. You could see in every eye the same thought. Who was she, and why had she come here to beg? You have to understand something about the frontier. Mercy could cost you more than money. It could make you look weak, and in a place where only the toughest survived, weakness was something to hide. Folks shifted in their chairs, pretending to study their hands or their whiskey, wishing she'd just go away so they wouldn't have to decide whether to care. But Nathan Cade, sitting alone at the end of the bar, didn't look away. He set down his drink, reached for the last half of his biscuit, and held it out to her. Then, almost as an afterthought, he placed a silver dollar on top. No speeches, no pity, just a quiet gift that made every man in that room question what he might have done in the same moment. Funny how one small gesture can crack open something you didn't even know was locked tight. The girl took the biscuit like it was something holy, her eyes big as moonrise. That single moment, her trembling hand, his steady gaze, was the first note in a song neither of them knew they'd be singing for the rest of their lives. And that's what makes this story worth telling, because out here, one act of kindness was enough to change the course of everything that came next. When Nathan rose from his chair, the girl flinched, probably expecting him to shoo her away or scold her for begging. But he didn't say a word. He just nodded toward the door. She followed, biscuit and coin clutched to her chest, like they were the last things keeping her alive. Outside, the street shimmered with heat. Horses stamped and snorted, wagons creaked by, and not one soul missed the sight of the lonely rancher, walking slow so the barefoot girl could keep up. Folks leaned against porch posts, squinting after them. Some whispered about Nathan's dead wife, about how he'd been talking to her grave for years. Others guessed the girl must be some runaway with a bounty on her head. But no one dared step into their path to ask. That's how it was in the Wild West. People were nosy, sure, but fear kept most questions locked behind tight lips. They walked past the blacksmith's forge, where the air shimmered with heat and the ring of hammer on iron sounded like the heartbeat of the town. They passed the old telegraph office, where a message could bring good news or ruin. Nathan didn't look back once. He didn't have to. Every eye in town was already on them. Out beyond the last fence, where the prairie rolled out endless and pale, he finally spoke. "You got a name?" She looked up, her chin lifting a little with the pride that never quite dies, no matter how hungry you are. "Lark," she said, voice soft as wind in dry grass. "Lark Morley." They didn't talk much after that, just kept walking step for step, under a sky so big it made you feel like you'd never be alone again, or maybe that you always would be. By the time they reached his ranch house, the sun was sinking into the ridges, painting everything gold. And still, he hadn't asked her why she'd come, because sometimes the right question isn't what brought you here, but what happens now. Long before the sun was up again, word had spread. Bear Ridge loved a story, especially one that looked like it might end in scandal, and no one could spin a tale faster than Loretta Finch, a gambler with a violin case she never opened, and a grin that made grown men uneasy. She'd come into town months earlier, saying she'd lost her fortune in Cheyenne and would win it back with her wits. Folks believed her because no one could prove otherwise. When Loretta saw Nathan and Lark crossing the prairie, she knew she'd found something richer than silver. She started whispering to the saloon regulars that Lark was no ordinary runaway. She was a witch child from Red Hollow, cursed to bring bad luck wherever she stayed. She even swore she'd heard a bounty had been posted by some lawman eager to keep his secrets buried. Most folks knew Loretta's stories were as crooked as a mountain trail, but it didn't matter. The tale stuck anyway. By dusk, the whispers had crawled through every corner of town. Some people pitied the girl, others figured Nathan was a fool for bringing trouble home. But no one was brave enough to ride out and see the truth for themselves. That's the funny thing about rumors. They grow best in places too scared to check the facts. Out on the ranch, Lark tried to thank Nathan again for the biscuit and the coin. He only shrugged, as though it wasn't worth speaking about. But she couldn't forget it. When she watched him oil the hinges on the barn door or fill the troughs for the cattle, she felt something she hadn't known in a long time. Safe. Maybe it was a dangerous thing to feel in a place where nothing stayed quiet for long, but it was the first hope she'd tasted since she'd run from Red Hollow, and she clung to it the way a drowning person clings to driftwood. Neither of them knew that by morning a letter would be on its way to Barlow Jack Redden, offering a bounty bigger than any the town had ever seen. And that soon every step they took would be measured by how far they were willing to go to protect each other. Sunrise came with a chill that seeped into your bones, no matter how thick your coat. Nathan tried to keep his mind on chores. Fixing fence rails was honest work, something that didn't care about gossip or the past. He'd done it 100 times without thinking, but that morning his hand was clumsy. Maybe he'd spent too much of the night listening to Lark breathe soft and steady in the little storeroom off the kitchen, wondering what had driven her so far from home. The post slipped. He reached to catch it, but the heavy timber crashed down across his knuckles before he could pull back. He didn't make a sound, just sat there, head bowed, while blood soaked the dirt. That was the thing about Nathan. He never let on how much something hurt, which made folks think he didn't feel much at all. Lark ran to his side, her face pale as flour. "Let me help." Her hands fluttered over the wound, too small to lift the post. She grabbed the crowbar and wedged it under, straining until the weight shifted enough for Nathan to drag his hand free. He tried to wave her off, but she wouldn't be moved. She tied a strip of her dress around the mess of broken skin, fingers steady in a way that made him look twice. They were still there when Dr. Silas Holt rode up. Silas had once been an army surgeon, patching soldiers in makeshift tents from Texas to Montana. Now he lived a quieter life, trading his skills for eggs and milk instead of medals. He cleaned the wound in silence, the only sound the rasp of his breath and the occasional snort from Nathan's gray mare. When he was done, Silas sat back on his heels and met Nathan's gaze. "This could fester. You need to rest or you'll lose the hand." The words hit harder than any fence post. A rancher without a strong right hand was like a piano missing half its keys, useless. Lark didn't wait for Nathan to argue. "I'll help," she said, voice firm. "I can keep the accounts and feed the herd." It would have been easy to laugh at her. She was young and too thin, with no real experience on a ranch, but something in her tone stopped Nathan cold. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, like she was claiming a place she'd already decided was hers. And right then he realized how little he knew about her. What kind of past had made her so sure she could stand in the middle of nowhere and survive? Silas gave her a long look, like he was trying to see straight through her. Then he nodded. "I'll come back in a few days." He didn't say what everyone was thinking. that this might be the end of Nathan's ranch if the wound turned bad. When the doctor rode off, the morning was still and cold. Nathan watched Lark carry the feed bucket, her shoulders set. He couldn't tell whether her grit was born of hope or desperation. Maybe it was both. And in that quiet, he understood that their stories were already twisted together, whether they'd meant them to be or not. The next weeks passed in a strange rhythm. Lark waking before dawn to tend the herd, Nathan fighting to teach his left hand how to do the work his right used to do without thinking. Every night he'd lie awake listening for the hoofbeats of trouble, because trouble always came. The only question was when. One night it did. The wind carried a smell so foul it tore Nathan from the edge of sleep. He limped to the corral, his heart hammering. That's when he saw her. His gentlest mare, the one his wife had named Faith, lay in the dirt with her throat cut clean. Blood pooled around her legs, soaking into the dust. It was too dark to see much else, but a glint by the fence caught the moonlight. He picked it up, bone-handled, stained, with letters carved so rough you could feel the grooves. B.J.R. Barlow Jack Redden. Lark came up behind him, arms wrapped around herself like she was holding something in. She didn't cry, didn't scream, just bent down and sifted through the dirt until her fingers closed on something cold and round. A red hollow coin. She held it up between thumb and forefinger, and in that moment, everything they'd been trying to ignore crashed into the open. Whoever she was running from had followed her all the way here. When dawn broke, the ranch was already buzzing with whispers. Neighbors came to help bury the mare and rebuild the fence, but nobody asked too many questions. In Bear Ridge, you learned fast to mind your own business. Still, everyone knew this was a message. A warning that the bounty was real and Barlow Jack was coming to collect. Lark stood by the fresh-turned earth, her braid lifting in the wind. "I should go," she said quietly, "before he kills something else." But Nathan shook his head, the bandages on his hand stark against the morning light. "You're not running anymore." He didn't know yet how he'd keep that promise, only that he couldn't watch her walk away. Because if she left, the place would go back to the hollow shell it was before she arrived. And maybe he was starting to understand that some folks are worth any fight, no matter how mean the odds. After the attack, there was no more pretending life could go back to normal. Every creak of the barn door set Nathan's teeth on edge. Every howl of a coyote sounded too close. He tried to stay busy, tried to prove to himself he could still do ranch work with one good hand. But there were limits he couldn't ignore, and that burned worse than the wound ever did. One afternoon, while Lark was hauling water, a shadow crossed the yard. Cloudwalker, the Cheyenne tracker, had a way of appearing so quiet it felt like he stepped out of the air itself. He looked at Nathan's bandaged hand and the fresh grave where Faith lay, and nodded like he'd been expecting it all along. "Barlow Jack doesn't forgive," he said, voice low and steady. "But sometimes he forgets to look behind him." Nathan knew what Cloudwalker meant. Information, a trade, but this time the tracker didn't want coin. "Someday you'll owe me a favor," he said, "something honest." Nathan held out his left hand to seal the agreement. Cloudwalker took it, and for a moment the ranch felt less lonely. While Nathan learned to write receipts with his awkward scrawl, Lark learned other things. She practiced with the old Colt revolver, the one Nathan's father had carried all the way from Missouri. She saddled up the sorrel mare each morning, riding out to the ridge and back until her seat was steady. And in the evenings, when her muscles burned and her hands were raw, she sat at Catherine Cade's piano, the same piano Nathan hadn't touched since the funeral. She played scales until they turned into something close to a song, something that reminded them both of what they were fighting for. That's when Loretta Finch came back into the story. She'd disappeared for weeks, but she never stayed gone long. She showed up one evening, leaning in the doorway like she'd never left. "I heard Barlow Jack's planning to burn you out," she said almost cheerfully. "He says you made him look foolish." Then she shrugged. "He's already paid 2 men to help him." Lark looked at Nathan. For the first time, her eyes were scared. And right then, Nathan realized the decision he'd made the day he gave her that biscuit. He wasn't going to let her face this alone, even if it cost them everything. The prairie wind had a way of playing tricks on you. One moment it was a sigh through the grass. The next, it was the roar of something coming for your life. That night, the wind turned hot and wild. Nathan felt it before he saw it, the sudden dryness in the air, the way the cattle shifted uneasily in their pens. Lark was at the piano, her fingers trying to remember the waltz Catherine Cade used to play on quiet nights. She'd nearly found it when the first shouts split the dark. Flames tore across the plain, racing toward the barn faster than any man could run. For a second, no one moved. Then instinct took over. Nathan grabbed the pump handle, working it with his good hand while Lark dragged buckets. Every drop felt like nothing against the wall of fire. The heat was so fierce it curled the hairs on their arms. Sparks rained down like burning hail. Somewhere in the darkness, Cloudwalker's voice called, guiding the cattle away from the worst of it. But the smoke was too thick to see more than a few steps. That's when Lark did something no one would have believed if they hadn't seen it themselves. She turned from the buckets, ran to the piano, and began to play. The first notes were shaky, but they carried through the smoke like a bell calling the lost home. Nathan heard the melody, Catherine's waltz, the song he hadn't let himself think about for years, and he knew exactly where she was. He stumbled toward the sound, the memory of Catherine's hands on the keys filling in what his eyes couldn't find. Cloudwalker appeared beside him, a dark shape against the flames. Together they fought through the smoke, leading the last of the cattle out past the burning fence. The barn was a lost cause, the roof collapsing in a shower of sparks. But the herd was alive. Lark was alive. And when the worst of the fire burned itself out, the 3 of them stood in the ashes, breathing hard, hearts pounding with something that felt a lot like defiance. Later, Nathan would think about how she'd played that piano, how her music had become a lifeline in a night made of terror. He'd think about how she didn't wait to be told what to do. She just did what needed doing. And he'd realized that in that moment, he'd stopped seeing her as a girl he'd saved. She'd become the person who'd saved him, too. They spent the rest of the night stamping out embers and counting heads, making sure nothing else would catch. When dawn came, it painted the ruined barn in soft gold. And despite everything they'd lost, Nathan felt lighter than he had in years, because standing beside the wreckage was proof that some things, hope, music, love, could survive anything. 2 days after the fire, Sheriff Eldred came riding up the track, his long coat trailing dust behind him. He didn't look eager to be there. Nobody liked delivering bad news to a man who'd just lost half his livelihood. But duty was duty. He dismounted slow, holding out a folded paper sealed with a red stamp. Nathan took it with a sinking feeling. He already knew what it would say. The bounty on Lark's head had doubled. Whoever posted it was willing to pay enough to tempt any drifter with a gun and no conscience. Sheriff Eldred shifted from one boot to the other. "I can't protect you out here, Nate. You know that." Nathan nodded. He'd never expected the law to do much. Out on the range, you learned early that help rarely came in time. The sheriff looked past him to the house. "She's still here?" he asked quietly. Nathan didn't answer. He didn't have to. Inside, Lark was packing what little she owned. A comb, a scrap of lace, the silver dollar he'd given her. She laid them in a bundle, her hands moving like she'd rehearsed it 100 times. On the kitchen table, she left a note written in careful letters. "Thank you. I can't let you lose more on my account." By the sill, she placed Catherine's handkerchief, folded neat as a promise. She stepped out into the cold dawn, thinking she'd slip away without a word. But Nathan was already waiting under the cottonwood tree. His breath smoked in the air, and for once, he looked as tired as he felt. "Running doesn't end it," he said, voice low. "I know, I tried." She started to argue, but he held up his bandaged hand. "You said you'd help me. You did. Now let me help you." Lark felt her throat close up. "I'm not worth it," she whispered. Nathan stepped closer, searching her face like he was memorizing it. "That's the thing about this place," he said. "It's never been quiet, just empty. You're the sound that filled it." For a long moment, neither spoke. The sky went pale, the color of old bone. Finally, she nodded, not because she believed she deserved saving, but because she'd learned that sometimes you had to let someone stand beside you, even if you were sure you'd fall. Sheriff Eldred watched them from the porch. He didn't say a word. Maybe he knew there was nothing to say. Out here, a man made his own peace with what he chose to protect. And Nathan Cade had made his choice. Spring came slow that year, cautious as a fawn. The town fair was the first time Bear Ridge felt anything close to normal again. Banners hung from storefronts, and the air smelled of fresh pies and wagon grease. Folks wandered between stalls, pretending they hadn't spent the winter listening for gunshots. Nathan and Lark kept to the edges of the crowd. They knew better than to think they were safe just because the sun was shining. But for a little while, it felt good to stand among neighbors, to remember what it was like to be part of something bigger than fear. They didn't see Charles Dorn until he was almost on them. He rode in like he owned the world, Barlow Jack Redden at his side. Dorn wore a grin too wide to be trusted. In his hand, he held a folded bounty paper. "I'll be taking her," he called over the music. "Official business." Every head turned. The fair went silent, the fiddlers' bows frozen mid-note. Dorn swung off his horse and strutted forward, waving the paper like it was a royal decree. "You all know this girl's wanted. I'm claiming the bounty." Lark's hand found Nathan's. He squeezed it once, then stepped forward. "You got proof that bounty's real?" Dorn laughed. "Got the stamp, don't I?" He held it higher. That's when Loretta Finch stepped out of the crowd, her violin case balanced easy on one hip. "I've got something too," she said, her voice carrying clear across the square. Loretta flipped open the ledger she'd been keeping on Dorn's debts. Every unpaid marker, every IOU he'd ever sworn he'd settle. "You owe more than you'd ever collect," she announced, "and you forged that bounty." A murmur ran through the crowd. Then Dr. Holt stepped up, his face grave. "And I heard Barlow Jack brag about killing Nate's mare." Sheriff Eldred moved at last. He took the paper from Dorn, studied the seal, and sighed. "This is fake," Dorn sputtered, but no one was listening anymore. The sheriff clapped irons on his wrists. Barlow Jack watched it all unfold with that flat, dead stare. Then, in the space of a heartbeat, he turned and walked away into legend. As the crowd erupted in noise, Nathan pulled a small cedar ring from his pocket. He'd carved it from the beam that fell the night of the fire. Without a word, he slipped it onto Lark's finger. She looked at him like she couldn't quite believe he was real. But he was. And so was the life they'd built. Right there in the dust. Summer in Wyoming has a way of sneaking up on you. One day the wind still carries a bite, and the next, the prairie bursts with wildflowers so bright they look painted on. By the time the barn was rebuilt, the ridge behind it was covered in blossoms, their petals fluttering like tiny flags of victory. Inside the new barn, the beams smelled fresh and clean, cut from pine hauled all the way from Casper. Nathan stood in the doorway one evening, watching Lark as she worked. She was tuning the old piano, what was left of it after the fire. The keys were scorched and a few were missing their ivory, but she coaxed music from it anyway. The sound drifted into the dusk, so soft it felt like a blessing. And beside the hearth, a cradle rocked gently, carved from the same cedar that held up the rafters. In it lay a sleeping baby, her tiny fist wrapped around the same silver dollar that had started it all. Lark looked up and caught Nathan watching her. She smiled, tired but sure, like a woman who knew she'd finally outrun the past. Every evening neighbors drifted by to see the baby and bring small gifts, baskets of cornbread, hand-sewn quilts, jars of sweet preserves. The same people who once whispered about Lark's curse now spoke of her courage. They said her story was a real Wild West miracle, proof that no matter how far you'd fallen, you could stand back up again. Nathan never claimed he deserved any of it. But when he watched Lark lift the baby and sway to the piano's song, he felt something he'd nearly forgotten. Hope. Hope that a man with a busted hand and a heart full of old grief could build something that lasted. Hope that a runaway girl could become the soul of a place everyone thought was cursed. Late at night, when the lamps burned low, he'd sit on the porch and remember that first day in the saloon. How easy it would have been to look away, to let her leave hungry. But he hadn't. And he knew now that kindness doesn't just change the person who receives it. It changes the one who offers it too. So if you're ever tempted to think a small mercy doesn't matter, think of that biscuit, that silver coin, and the dusty trail that led to this cradle. Remember how love on the range can start with the smallest gesture and end with a legacy bigger than any bounty. The prairie wind carried their story far beyond Bear Ridge, weaving it into the legend of the frontier. Folks still talk about the lonely rancher and the girl who played a piano waltz in the dark, about the fire that nearly ended them and the love that saved them instead. And when you hear it, I hope you'll think about your own leftover moments, the chances you have to change a life without even knowing it. Because in the end, that's the true heart of every Western romance. Not the shootouts or the cattle drives or the dusty saloons. It's the belief that even the hardest life can be transformed by one act of quiet, stubborn kindness.